Okay. So let's go ahead and begin. So this morning's session, we're going to focus on abating and capturing the costs that are seen by project costing pursuant to what we've set up in our customer contracts. For the last several days, we focused exclusively on setting up our grants and setting up those customer contracts. And from this point forward, if you've done all your setup correctly, these next steps, it's a little bit, it's something to conceptually wrap your heads around, but it really isn't a lot of work. This is the value of PeopleSoft or something like PeopleSoft, where it's using conditions and logic that we've established to do our work for us. And certainly there's business processes that each department uses that, the functional team that we can, down the road work with you to modify and customize the system to meet your business process. And some of them just require a change in business process for the departments themselves to comport with the system as delivered, and that we're not going to necessarily spend millions of dollars to configure differently. So let's go ahead and head into abating and capturing the costs for this morning. And next, the final section will be running the actual billing process itself and showing you the results in the respective environments. So you have to bear with me on some of this in the environment. I'm dealing with kind of the test data and the test environment, so there will be times when I need to run a process in the background. So we'll have just a couple minutes of downtime while I run those. Yeah. Okay, so the business process associated with grants. So we've already discussed setting up. The vast majority of what we want to talk about is setting these documents up in the first place. That's the very first step you do. You either set them up or you clean up your customer contracts. You make sure that all the configuration is what you need to be in the system. So that's what we talked about over the last 5 sessions. Yesterday afternoon during the capital projects, capital projects that are funded by multiple grants. Not everyone sat in on that one, but I did go through an example of setting up a commitment control journal. So establishing the budget for that separately, completely outside of the grants module. That's a step that you need to take before you can incur costs. And then once you have the budget that's set up for that particular project, then you can actually incur the costs against that project. And that, again, all of those activities exist outside of the grant module. This is your procurement activities. These are your payroll, your manual entries in the general ledger, all the sorts of things, all the sorts of transactions that you take throughout the financial system that are not grant. They're not necessarily directly related to the business process of setting these things up. It's a normal business process that you use to buy things and pay for time and labor. So jumping in at this point is the next step after you've incurred the expense transaction is you abate the cost to the project and activity that's associated with your customer contract that you want to bill for this. Now, this is an optional step. Ideally, in an ideal world, you are incurring your costs at the delivery, at the activity itself that's linked to the customer contract, and so that's going to be the case for most operating type grants, or where the relationship between the funding source and the delivery activity is kind of a one-to-one relationship. But there are cases, some departments have business processes where they incur a bunch of costs to a general fund, and then they don't allocate those to a grant funding source until year end. That takes a bit more work to do that, but at some point it might be worth figuring out a way to work with you to sit down and see if we can work at a funds distribution or allocation type solution to allocate costs in a logical way so we don't have to do this all at year end. In any case, so abate the cost if it's necessary. Hopefully it's not. And once you've either incurred the cost or abated the cost, wait overnight, and then the system does a batch process where it collects those costs from all of the submodules, including the general ledger, sends it over to project costing, and then the next day, the next morning, you'll see those values reflected in the general ledger. You'll see that revenue recognized in the general ledger, and you will see values in billing awaiting action from you, one way or the other. If you take no action in billing, it just sits there in perpetuity. And so we saw a bit of that at the end of FY18. There's about $150 million in billing transactions that were never adjudicated. And so this AOSD requested the systems team just reverse all those since users were either there was an issue with the customer contract linking or the user was just doing manual billing offline and manually recognizing the revenue completely outside of PeopleSoft. So you wait overnight, those transactions are available, and then you run one of these queries so you can validate that the transactions that you expect to see to be assembled and attributed to your customer contract are available for billing. So I've gone over these queries once before, but these are, you can do this by either customer contract or by project, and it just shows you what data is sitting there awaiting action or has completed your billing activity, and I'll tell you that as well. At that point, you can troubleshoot whether or not there's transactions there that either aren't appearing, that you anticipate them appearing, or vice versa, that are appearing and they shouldn't be. You know, the latter is a bit more is a ticket type situation. The former, I'll walk through it, just a quick troubleshooting cheat sheet that we can talk through. And then once kind of the lines are roughly where you want them, then you run the billing process. And I can show you during the billing process how you can eliminate, you know, individual bad lines from your bill if necessary. Okay, so here are the categories of common troubleshooting issues. So one is, and these are informed by tickets that I've received over the last year, kind of like what are the things that I saw were common themes when someone sent me a ticket and they said, hey, this isn't working the way I'm anticipating it working. These are the major buckets of things that I saw that were kind of issues with customer contracts. One, was the customer contract active, or was it active at the time that the individual ran the billing? So if it's yes, the answer should be yes to all these questions. If it's no, then that's an area where you can explore how to troubleshoot with the systems team. Two, did I post my expenditure to one of the grant funds? So if yesterday and previous sessions I showed you the query grant fund to billing that associates the actual 5-digit grant fund code to the reimbursable rate set, right? If you used a fund in your transaction that's not on one of those rate sets, then it's not going to trigger any sort of billing or revenue recognition, right? So if you post, even if you post to a project activity that's linked to a customer contract, if you're using the general funds for that transaction, it's not going to trigger billing. If my expenditure, or my cost came directly from a general ledger journal entry, did I use one of the correct analysis types? So if you incorrectly put a balance sheet transaction analysis type on your entries, project costing is not going to see those as valid expenditure activities. So if you use the journal uploader and you did a BAL analysis type for every entry on your journal entry, then project costing is going to say, hey, it's not a GLE, MND, MNR, PAY analysis type. I'm not going to do anything further with it. Did I post my expenditure after I activated my customer contract? If you didn't, right, and that's what I mentioned before. If the expenditure predates when you activated your customer contract, or predates, you change the effective date of the rates, and actually that's the next item down. So did I post my expenditure after the effective date on my contract terms? Then we need to work together to either retroactively date your effective date on your rate, or we need to just run a process that we call pricing to catch those transactions retroactively. If you hadn't activated your customer contract for months and we're still incurring costs there. Has my customer contract remained unchanged since I activated it? So did you change the billing limit? Did you change project activity associations? Do you have unprocessed amendments? So was your customer contract amended, but you left that amendment sitting there and you didn't fully process it? Then your customer contract is not necessarily going to capture these costs. It's going to be in a kind of a temporary status until you resolve your pending changes. Are the sum of all my expenditures still under the billing limit for the customer contract? So I've seen this where a user, there is a billing limit on the customer contract for a reason it's lower than what remained, or they had incurred more costs than they were anticipating. Regardless, but if you overbill or if you over-incur costs, if you reach that limit, all the rows, everything that exceeds the amount in the billing limit is not going to be something that's going to be picked up for billing. It's going to be what's called over the limit. And we can see that in the queries. It's going to tell us that, hey, these are transactions, these are amounts that exceed the total amount that's available for billing. But that's something that causes folks issues. And then lastly, this is a question. Usually, I've gotten this question when a user, the trial balance is showing them something abnormal, and I've seen where users are doing manual journal entries to the automated revenue account and the unbilled accounts receivable accounts. And since those are manual journal entries, they're not system-generated ones. It's from a support perspective, we can't undo that. It's a user that's messing with those accounts as opposed to the system messing with those accounts. And so, if you've done manual entries there, that's not something that systems can necessarily help with. I mean, we can help inform what the system would do if you used it. But if you're doing manual entries here, it's kind of a case-by-case basis, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's go ahead and head into the environment. Any questions first before I do that? Those categories of things that, troubleshooting lists that trigger any sort of issues that you've encountered. Please let me know. Yes.
You said if you have expenditure first and then you activate your customer contract later, so the charges between those times would not be picked up over there.
Yep.
And the way to fix it is to issue a ticket and you guys can do the repricing.
Yep.
The second option is to just simply for us to change the name under the rate.
No. So the question Annie's asking is, she's restating that if let's say I incur a cost in July and I activate my customer contract in September, the system will not see that cost in July to pick it up for billing or revenue recognition. And Annie wanted to clarify how we can fix that situation when we do want to pick that up. The answer is send a ticket. I mean, we can distribute a job aid, and maybe down the road, once folks are really using this on a regular basis, it makes sense for you, because users can run this process, but we have to manually run a process called pricing. So it basically says, hey, look for this particular project, look at all the rows that are sitting in project costing, and are any of them now eligible under an active customer contract to be billing? So it says, hey, relook at all the things that are in project costing, and are there anything that now applies to a new customer contract that's been activated since the expense transaction posted? And so I think, to clarify further what you were asking, which is the effective date of that rate, you just need to make sure that the effective date of that rate set, regardless of whether or not it's active or not, is effective when you want those transactions to be picked up for billing. So like, for example, let's say you had a customer contract, you activated it in September, and the effective date of that rate set on the contract terms is also in September, it wouldn't see a July transaction even if the system's functional team with a ticket re-ran pricing. We'd have to have you retroactively date the contract terms there.
You need to do two things, the ticket and the change date to July.
Yes. I mean, there are some folks who set up a customer contract, the effective date is correct of the rate set, but they just didn't activate the contract until, so it kind of depends on what your situation is. So it might just be one thing, activate the contract and then we run pricing. Yeah, good questions. Other questions? Okay. So Sally sent us some live data in the system that we're going to use to illustrate. We're going to illustrate kind of what the system's seeing. So basically this state of play, and this is for a number of users, is that they have projects that were grant-related projects. They needed to bill the grant sponsor and didn't have sufficient time or bandwidth to use PeopleSoft to generate that bill, and so they generated a bill offline, not using PeopleSoft. And so this is Sally's case right here. She's got total amount that she's billed by month for 2 separate projects, and the way that she compiled those amounts was to use commitment control, so the commitment control budget overview page, to kind of sum up the total amounts that are eligible for billing by accounting period. So what we're going to do here is, ostensibly, in July, there were $6,674 worth of expense transactions that should be eligible. So the question here is, does the system see all of those expense transactions? Right? So because, it could be using the troubleshooting questions I asked before, maybe the customer contract wasn't active, or maybe it's linked to the wrong project activity, maybe it's linked to a different activity on that same project, maybe there's a pending amendment to that customer contract. And so, this is an area where, moving forward, you got to make sure that the human logic that you use to assemble this data matches the system logic, and hopefully we can move to a place where there's no more human logic. You're just relying on the system to compile the costs for you. So I'm not gonna have Sally on pins and needles while I demonstrate this. The nice thing is that her logic perfectly matches up with the system logic. So all the costs that she's pulling from commitment control were actually also seen by billing, and I'll show you that in just a second here. All right, so let's go ahead and use the query viewer. So I want to look at the transactions that are triggering billing by project. I'm going to use version 2 of this query. Again, that requires you to have an AP viewer role, I think maybe even a PO viewer role, GL viewer role. The one without the version 2, that one just requires you to have the project costing viewer role. So I'm going to run this actually to Excel so I can pivot some information here real quick. So this is the first project on Sally's example. So this is opening up in Excel. So I'm going to do something real quick to pivot this data. I'm going to insert a pivot table. And I want to look at the accounting date for the transactions and the billing amounts. I want to sum those billing amounts. So here, going back to the raw data, these are, each row is the chart field string associated with the original expense transaction. So it's the project, the description of the project. Actually, sorry for, I'm going to zoom in on this. Folks see? It's the project, the description, the project's description, the activity's description, the account, fund, authority, and department associated with that transaction. Note, of course, that this, in order for this to have triggered billing, it had to use one of the grant funds. This is a payroll journal, so the analysis type is going to be PAY. This is the journal header for that particular payroll journal, the date that the journal was posted, the line on this particular journal, so that we all know those payroll journals are massive. Yeah, and the line description on a payroll journal is not really helpful information, but because it's always HR payroll journal template. But the fiscal year, the accounting period in that fiscal year, which ledger it posted to, and I'm going to make a comment about that towards the end. Please remind me if I don't talk about CAFRM Mod and CAFRM Full by the end of this session. Please remind me. And if the expense transaction was associated with a procurement item, then it's going to include the supplier ID, supplier name, the invoice that the supplier billed us for, the date of their invoice to us, the voucher that we used to pay that invoice, the voucher line number, and separately, if it was an employee expense that was eligible for reimbursement to the grant, it's going to include the expense report ID item here, the transaction date, and the accounting date. Most often, they're going to be the same if it's coming from general ledger. The source analysis type, remember we've talked in these sessions, there's 6 analysis types that trigger billing. If you're doing a balance sheet entry, a BAL, it will not trigger billing. If you're if you're in the general ledger, you got to select GLE, MND, MNR, or PAY. This is the source description. It kind of depends on what the source is, on where that's pulling that information from, but in project costing, this is like the project costing understanding of what the source is. This is the source amount. So this is the original expense transaction that was triggering the billing. Moving over, this is the billing analysis type. The billing analysis type is going to be BIL, right? If it's a value awaiting you to take some sort of action, it's going to be BLD if you build it. And when I go through billing, I'll talk through the other billing and the other analysis types associated with billing. CCSS billing amount. So this is the amount that will be billed or was billed for that line. So in most cases, these two amounts will be identical, right? In fact, that would be concerning if it wasn't based on our reimbursement rates. Now remember, if we were in the private sector, we could have some sort of pricing rule or rate set to mark up these values. We did consulting, and so the cost to me was, the cost to the city was $60 an hour, but we want to bump it up to 25%, right? So we do an add-on to that cost. For us, in our case, we just bill at the exact amounts of the cost that we incurred. The only time when these rows are going to be different is if you, in the case that you hit a billing limit. So let's say your billing limit was $1,000 bucks. You've got one transaction that hit for $900, so you're going to bill for that $900. You had another transaction that hit for $300. then what's going to happen here is there's going to be two rows. There's going to be the source transaction row saying $300, and it's going to have analysis type of BIL for $100, because it's going to square up to the max billing limit. And then there's going to be another row saying the source billing transaction was $300, and it's going to have a $200 over the limit row saying, hey, you incurred costs that exceeded by $200 the amount of your billing limit. And we're never going to be able to bill this unless you change the billing limit or abate that cost to some other grant source. CCSF invoice is the actual, if you run billing and completed the billing process, it's going to appear here and say and identify this is what our invoice to the grant sponsor is for the cost that we want them to reimburse us for. The billing date here, it auto-populates with 1/1/1900 until you've taken action in billing, either to defer billing or the date that you actually ran the billing invoice for. And then this is the associated customer contract ID, this contract ID we know based on everything we've learned to date, scrolling all the way to the beginning, that this customer contract ID is linked to this project and this activity. Right? Otherwise, I mean, logically, we wouldn't have rows here if it wasn't linked that way. Scrolling back over the customer contract, and then, of course, the customer ID. These columns all the way to the right, you can ignore them. They're technical data to help us troubleshoot. You know, when you send a ticket, we run this query on the back end to see what's going on. I am going to flag for the group in case you want to get a sense for one important detail here. This column right here, B, this is billing distribution. So this is a technical flag, but I get tickets about this sort of status all the time, and this will be helpful for you to kind of troubleshoot what's going on. So the billing distribution status, if the status is P, that's telling us that the value in project costing has been priced. It's sitting there and it's waiting for you to take action. It's associated with a BIL row the first time it comes through. But if a user does any sort of billing activity with this, it changes. If you send it from customer contracts to billing at any stage, it's going to change the status to W, which means worksheet. And if you've done any billing step and you sent it to worksheet, then you cannot send that through again. You have to deal with this value somewhere in billing. You don't do it you can't restart the billing process again from step one. You have to do something affirmative with that one. So I see this all the time. Tickets come through. Someone says, hey, I'm trying to run billing, but these rows aren't appearing in the billing worksheet. Why is this not happening? And I go into the backend. I use this query, but I also go into the backend database, and I see that the user or someone on the team has initiated billing at some point, and then they just left it kind of sitting in the billing process somewhere, and then they can't pick that back up again. And so it makes it difficult for the end user to see, like, well, why can't I bill this right now? One user, for example, ran billing citywide back in, I think it was May, and once that happened, every single BIL row across the city was actually in a W status. So any user that wanted to run billing would get this message, no bill plans processed, when they ran the first step of the billing process, because a user had run billing citywide and it was all in a W status. We've since fixed that, but and it's possible a user could run billing again citywide, but in any case. So this is not necessary. You can submit a ticket, and I've walked this through with Karen on how to troubleshoot that specific problem. But I just wanted, that is a resource for you if you want to troubleshoot something proactively on your side before it comes over to us. Okay, so So that's the raw data, and I just pivoted it. If you're not familiar with pivoting, it's just taking the raw data, all of the data here, and summing it per all the entries that occurred in July, the sum of all the billing values there. And the nice thing is here, going back to Sally's email, we know that July and August figures match up precisely. That's I was really happy that that's the case, because the logic that the department's using to assemble these costs is aligned with the logic that the system's going to use, so it's going to be easier for them to adopt this sort of functionality. Okay. I could run the same, if it's helpful, I can run the same query on the other project, but the results are the same. So the amount that the system sees as eligible for billing is the same for July and August. And during the next session this morning, we'll go ahead and run billing actually on these so you can see how that assembles those costs. One quick comment about human assembly of these. So if you're using commitment control to assemble costs, remember when anything is budget checked, it's reflected in commitment control as a cost, even though it hasn't necessarily been an actual cost yet, right? Because it's just holding those funds, it's sequestering those funds until the actual cost gets posted. So, right, like when you budget check or when you edit your journal, you budget check your journal, that cost gets reflected immediately on commitment control, regardless of whether or not AOSD approves that journal or whether or not your leadership approves the journal or whatever, right? Same thing goes with the vouchers and requisitions, right? So if you've got recs that are encumbering funds, right, it's going to show on commitment control. So that's one area where kind of the sequence and business process matter. I think GL is going to be more aligned with what, project costing sees what GL sees in most cases. It has more data, and we've been working to make sure that the integrity of the project costing data is aligned on a one-to-one relationship with GL. There are cases where it doesn't, so I think I mentioned this on Monday and Tuesday sessions, but the journal vouchers that were coming over from AP vouchers, the analysis type for the cash balancing line was an incorrect analysis type. The system was generating a bad analysis type, and so we were getting two rows in project costing, the actual expenditure cost, and then the cash balancing line, which netted it out. And so a user, in order to bill effectively, the user was needing to write off the cash balancing line that was appearing in project costing. Okay, I think, are there any questions on how I'm using this query to kind of assemble costs and see what the system's got teed up for billing? Actually, what I should do here is, real quick, I'm going to add one more value here on the spreadsheet. I'm adding a billing analysis type of BIL. So these are all, this tells me that these are all values awaiting to be billed. And actually, I'm going to run one more of these real quick. Just to illustrate that. Further. Again, I just ran it on a different project that I know has a lot of billing activity associated with it. So let's do accounting date here. Type. So here, on this particular project, on this specific snapshot, there's nothing that remains to be billed. That's what that's telling me. And then from what has been billed are these amounts here, the BLD analysis type. The billing adjustments are, this user has gone in and because of likely bad data, as we were fixing kind of the bad data issues coming in from the other modules, they went in and did a billing adjustment. So they either adjusted the entire bill with one of our job bays or adjusted lines on that bill, and so that comes over as a BAJ analysis type. The other analysis types that you'll see are DEF, which is deferred. The user's deferred a line or lines on their project. OLT, which is over the limit. WTO, which is write off. And then very few folks are using prepaid functionality, but when you're running prepaid grants, it'll show up in this query as UTL, as utilized, which would be the same thing as a BLD, right? But instead of creating a new bill for a receivable, it actually just utilized that deferred or liability account amount. And then there is UAJ, which is a utilization adjustment, which is kind of like a billing adjustment. Again, I don't anticipate most of you will see that one until you're really actually using the functionality. So really, you can focus on BIL, BLD is kind of the main to be billed and has already been billed. If anyone has questions on online, you can also just type them into the preferably into the chat box as opposed to the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to it. Okay, so let's go ahead and real quickly, I'm gonna I've got, what time is it right now? I've got 18 minutes. Might run a little long. Sorry about that. But I'll record it so you can go back to it later. Yes, Jordan. Yes, that's correct. There's one there for the first week of FY17. So this is going back. There was 1 week where the unbilled, where the accounting wasn't being automatically processed from July 1st to July 8th of 2017, and that was intentional because there were a bunch of famous adjustments going in on that week, and so we didn't want the system to be recognizing revenue. But moving forward, definitely for FY19 and on, every BIL row will have a corresponding accounting value. And I can show you a query. It's not a query. It's not a query. It's a back-end database SQL select that links together that BIL row directly to the accounting entries, if that's helpful. I can show you that right now. It's going to be a lot of data that's probably too much to look at, but it's the sort of thing that, like, the data nerds like about PeopleSoft because it links it all together so that you're not, you know, the system's not doing anything that you can't follow, if that makes sense. Anyone want me to pull that up real quick? Or? Yeah? Okay. So using, oops. Using Sally's project as the example here. So this is not, the users aren't running this. but this is what we use to run our initial queries. So I didn't use Sally's project. I used the project, whatchamacallit, 1000216, because I'm more familiar with this one. So right here, so these two rows right here together are going to be the accounting entries for one BIL row. So tying together, this is the trigger analysis type and the source, right? This is PAY entry, if it had a voucher, a vendor, the associated journal, accounting date, the amount of the source transaction, the accounting string of the source transaction. It's doubled up here because of the debit and credit here. But it ties that BIL row here. Oh, I'm sorry, I got to want to see if I can zoom in here. It's really small for you all. I don't know if I can change the view here. Oh, here's an idea. Oh, that's funny. It's not displaying for the folks in the room. Yeah, it won't. I can't zoom in. I don't know how to zoom in. Sorry, folks. Folks in the room, I can't really show you. But put on your magnifying glasses. These two rows are the BIL analysis types. The journal associated with that analysis type is there, and the accounting date for that journal is here. This is the associated debit and credit, so the debit unbilled accounts receivable and the credit to the revenue for this particular project. And then the chart field, the rest of that chart field string for that debit and credit. Notice the only difference, right, is the account, and it inherits everything else from the cost transaction. So there's too much data on the screen right now. It's overwhelming. You don't need to look at all these rows. But my point here is that you can tie that BIL row directly to the debit and credit associated with, as long as what we've done on our back end is correct, that the system's automating the accounting. Certainly there are cases where something's gone afoul and submit a ticket if you're not seeing that debit and credit. Yeah, does that resolve, Jordan, your question? Yeah. Okay. And Karen has that query. It's the sort of thing that we could put in production at some point if that's ever helpful. Okay, so let's real quick. I did want to abate costs. So in yesterday afternoon session, the capital grants session, we had set up whatchamacallit, we had set up budgets. We had set up a WBS. We had linked a couple of the activities to customer contracts. We set up the budget, and we incurred original costs at the delivery activities. And now what I want to do is I want to kind of pick up from there, and I want to abate the costs from the delivery activities to the activities associated with the customer contracts. So this was the original, just to catch everyone up who wasn't tracking this, this was the original journal that we posted. It was, you know, an expense to a, well, I'm not going to confuse matters here for folks that didn't tune in yesterday afternoon, but it was an expense to an activity 2, and this activity 2 is not associated with this customer contract here. Project costing, definitions, general information. So we've got 2 customer contracts here that are linked to activity 6 and activity 8. Let me zoom in here, sorry about that. Activity 6 and activity 8, this journal is posted to activity 2. So when I run the query, to see what is billing seeing for this, nothing comes up. No matching results were found. That means that in project costing, these values are sitting there, but they didn't generate rows for billing. So let's go ahead and copy journal. I'm going to process this. I'm going to make a copy of what I just did. If I'm not following general ledger rules or process and policy here, this is just to send data through the system. Contact your fund accountant, an AOSD, or the GLAM team to make sure that you follow the correct procedures with regards to copying journals and processing journals, et cetera. This is just for testing. I'm sure that I'm violating some process here. Okay, so what we're going to do is the original expenditure hit activity 2, so let's reverse that out. Actually, I want to just hide that. Okay, so I want to just reverse out that original line. I want to add back in that line, but to the correct activity using Fed funded. Hold on a sec real quick. I think our first one was the federal grant. It was. So we're using the federal fund. So this is a grant fund that we want to make sure that the abatement is hitting. Just to recap, these were the unallocated fund. This is the federal fund. If I use the unallocated fund here, it's not going to trigger billing. I'm not going to illustrate that. Make sure that the analysis type is eligible trigger analysis type. It's not a balance sheet item. I'm abating this 2 activities. Oh, my goodness. All right. I broke PeopleSoft, guys. I click around too quickly. Let's see if it saved anything there. Woohoo! Okay. Kind of saved some of it. Okay. So remember, I'm reversing out that original entry. I am adding it back in here, abating it to 6. And I think technically you're supposed to hit a cash account every time for correct policy and procedure, but I'm just going to, this journal will process. Oh my goodness, why did it delete both lines? Did I have both lines selected? I must have had both lines selected. I'm just going to redo that again so I don't confuse folks. Okay. I'm just going to take this line here. Violating process here by not hitting your balance sheet in this journal, but this should effectively proceed. And I think AOC might have some other accounts that you have to hit to kind of move the cash through. I'm just doing this in the GL. There's some PNP that I'm totally skipping here. But I've shortcutted it. I'm just abating from activity 2 to activity 6, skipping balance sheets, skipping other accounts that you have to hit to adhere to policy and procedure. So let's go ahead and process this journal. And I'm going to get an error because the budget, wait, hold on a sec. No, I'm not going to get an error on this. I shouldn't get an error on this. So the total budget for the project writ large is 602. Okay, so it created those bouncing lines for me. Great. Because, yeah, okay, created the bouncing lines because I've got my interfund. I'm going between funds here. The total budget for the project writ large is $602. And those that weren't tuned in yesterday, we set budgets at each activity. So activities 6, 7, 8, and 9 sum up to $602. But we set a billing limit for activity 6 at, I think, $100. And so what we're going to see here is I've abated the full cost of the original source expenditure to one activity. Erroneously, really, only $100 should have been abated to that activity. So we're going to see that reflected in the general ledger. So this demonstration will go, I think, maybe 10 minutes over. You can get the recording afterwards. Feel free, if you're in the room, to pop out, you know, because the next session doesn't, I had scheduled the next session at 10:30, so do what you need to do. Okay, so, what's that? I have the room for the morning, yeah. Let's go ahead and submit this journal. Okay, I'm going to pause something because I'm going to approve my journal. I just don't want to confuse matters for folks that aren't involved with approvals. Give me just a second. Are there any questions while I approve my journal? Anything that is jumping out? Anyone online? No? Okay. And I haven't said that yet during the session, but everything that I'm doing right now is in the test environment, so you're not going to see any of this reflected in when you go back to your computers and take a look. Alrighty. My journal's been approved. I'm now going to posting my journal. I'm not showing you right now, but I'm just letting you know that I'm posting the journal. I'm seeing the process monitor. Okay, so I'm waiting for my journal to post here. And I am going to show you one process here. Just want to verify that the journal did successfully post. One posted, no errors. Great. Okay, so this process happens every evening. It happens on the back end, so this is not something that you need to do. I just want to show you that this is something that happens every night and kind of how the sausage is made here, because I think it is helpful to know. But project costing is going to, every night it collects costs from the general ledger. So it says, hey, everything that was posted today, bring it over to project costing. So we have it set up so it runs citywide. I'm just going to do it so it runs so it's quicker here. I'm just going to run it for our test project here. And I'm going to run so right now. Everything that's coming, these lines from this journal here. Where's my journal? I lost my journal. I navigated away from it. I should actually pull that back up. So yeah, what it's taking is all 4 lines here. It's taking them over into project costing. And if I've done this correctly, if I've set up my customer contract correctly, and hopefully I've done all this correct, and if I didn't, I'll need to do an addendum to the group and let you all know what I did mess up. But if I did it correctly, then I abated the cost here, and what I hope to see when this collects correctly is I'm hoping to see that there will be a BIL row for $100 for this activity on this project when I rerun the query, and there will be an OLT amount of $502. So we shall see. The cost collect does take a little while. That's why we run it as a batch, and this isn't something that the user is supposed to run. Yeah. Thoughts, questions, concerns? So yeah, just kind of digging into this a little bit more, kind of reaffirming everything that we've been doing to date. So we've got a GLE. So these 2 are analysis types that trigger billing. But Activity 2 is not linked to a customer contract. Activity 6 is linked to a customer contract. And fund code 23060 is actually not a grant fund, so I wouldn't even if this activity was linked to a customer contract, I'm not using a correct grant fund for that original, for the abating out. 23020 is a grant fund, so I should see something in when I run this query. So I'm still processing. The current step is actually pricing. So right now it's collected the values in the project costing, and I can tell that pricing is running, and so it's looking at those rows and running calculations on those rows in project costing. And if conditions are met correctly, then we should see a BIL row in project costing. Yeah, Annie asks, what situations, conditions would a user do in MND? And actually, Annie's artfully pointed out here that I've probably I've done something inaccurate here. What I should have done is I should have had an analysis type of MND here on this line to indicate that this is a manual distribution as opposed to an original cost expenditure. So thank you for that. Yeah, so folks on the phone and for the reporting and for everyone in the room here, what I should have done is for this row here where I'm abating the cost to activity 6, I should have done MND, and I should have done an MNR, manual reversal, for the abatement from. And that's more important than, I mean, this is kind of a policy and procedure sort of thing that we want to see up, because you'll be able to report on out of project costing, and even in the general ledger, you'll be able to report on those transactions which were original costs versus abatements using these analysis types. You'll say, hey, which were, yeah, I mean, you'll be able to slice out what was the original expense and what was the abatement based on analysis type. So thank you for flagging that. Actually, that was an error on my part. Now, functionally, the system sees them both the same, and so we'll still be able to run billing on this. But it's a best practice moving down the road to use MND for those abatements. Is that clear? Since I made an error here, I want to make sure that I'm extra clear on what that means, why I would want to do MND versus GLE.
Is that only for the grant abatement only, or any abatement that in the system should use the MND and MNR?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sandra's asking, is this only grants related that should you use MND or MNR to abate from one cost to the other? I mean, I think at go live, our recommendation to AOSD and users writ large was to use MND, MNR regardless of what you were doing, just to flag that it was a different field to flag exactly what you're doing with that transaction. But the effect on the GL is the same. I mean, the analysis type doesn't change the quality of the debit or the credit, right? It's just a reporting value. So if you're reducing a certain account, it's going to reduce regardless of the analysis type used. That's a good one. Good question. All right. Ooh, still going here. Yeah, sometimes it can take 10 minutes. Yes? Yes, thank you. Yes, so thank you for reminding me of that one. I totally forgot. So here, navigating back to the CAFR full and the ledger that this was posted to. So right now the way the system is configured is the values from the general ledger come over to project costing regardless of the ledger that they're posted to. And right now, the pricing process runs on there's no way for us to, and from a configuration standpoint, this would require a pretty significant customization. Right now, the pricing process prices regardless of what ledger you post it to. So for CAFR Mod and CAFR Full, the folks making those entries, they're not actuals for the purpose of billing, right? These are just for the reporting purposes. So unfortunately, this right now is bad data that's going to be coming over into project costing the way that the system's currently configured. So any entries that you make to CAFR Mod and CAFR Full using an analysis type of GLE or MND or something like that is going to show up for pricing. And so the user is going to need to either write those rows off, so run the billing process and write them off, or down the road, hopefully we can configure a business process where your analysis type on those entries is all BAL or something like that. You know, and that way when it be picked up for billing, that would be one solution. So whether or not it's a business process or whether or not it's a system customization is yet TBD, but I did want to flag for you, and we did see this where data is coming over for billing when it's a CAFR Mod or CAFR Full entry, and we don't want that to be the case. I don't know why I earmarked that for later discussion. That was a pretty quick statement. Okay, message log. Let's see what project costing. 6 rows were processed. Okay. So the reason it says 6 rows as opposed to 4 from that journal is because I never collected the cost to project costing yesterday. So it just says 6 here. So, the moment of truth. Okay. So, I'm seeing what I was hoping to see here. I've got 2 rows here. This is the original source the abatement, right? Notice, so notice here that this project is only activity 6, so we never saw, the query isn't showing anything from the original source transaction activity 2, because activity 2 wasn't linked to a customer contract. This is our project activity, the original source of the abatement expenditure. Right, all the information that we've seen from the previous queries. Note here that we've got 2 rows here for the total amount of 602 here. So these 2 rows are duplicative up until this point here. But where it starts to differ here is that basically it splits it out. So we've got an original source transaction which for $602, and it created 2 rows in project costing. One BIL row for $100 that's eligible for billing, and one over the limit row for $502 because we had set the billing limit for customer contract 945 to $100. So it will prevent us from billing that sponsor. So that's one that kind of illustrates the difference between commitment control for expenditure and in the revenue side when you set a billing limit for billing a sponsor. The commitment control allowed us to abate the total cost of the contract to that activity, because the total budget for that project was $602, but we set a billing limit at $100, so it will prevent us from billing that sponsor more than what they agreed to pay us for these activities. And then the user has either the option of abating that cost further, right, from the activity to, in our test case, our example case, we did abate it to activity 8, because we had set up a customer contract there. I'm not going to do that because that's a little bit duplicative. But yeah, and so we'll take a 15-minute break right now, but what I'm going to do for the next session is I'm going to run billing on both Sally's examples and this test from end to end so you can see kind of what that billing process looks like and how we can actually make it a little bit streamlined for the city moving forward. All right? So folks online, I'm going to end this WebEx, and you'll need to click the link to the other WebEx and the email to join that session. All right? So I'm going to end this session now. Any questions for folks online, listening online? Type it in now. You can ask it during the next session too if you're a little shy in this particular session. Okay, great. All right, we'll and now reconvene at 10:30. Thanks, everyone.